By the summer of 1943, George S. Patton stood at the height of his battlefield reputation, yet closer than ever to personal collapse. The Sicilian campaign had showcased everything Patton believed about war: speed, aggression, and relentless pressure. His 7th Army raced across the island, capturing key cities ahead of Allied expectations and outmaneuvering German forces with audacity that stunned both enemies and allies. To the outside world, Patton looked unstoppable. But beneath the victories, something darker was brewing, a collision between Patton's uncompromising vision of war and the fragile human reality of the men who fought it. Patton believed, with almost religious conviction, that fear was the greatest enemy on the battlefield. He had spent decades studying history and had reached a conclusion that guided every decision he made. Armies did not collapse because they were outgunned, but because their will broke. In his mind, courage was not optional. It was a duty owed to fellow soldiers. Any sign of weakness threatened not just the individual, but the entire force. This belief had driven his success, but also blinded him to a truth he struggled to accept. Not all wounds were visible. The hospitals in Sicily were filled with men suffering from what was poorly understood: combat fatigue, shell shock, psychological trauma brought on by relentless bombardment and constant fear. To Patton, raised in a tradition that revered stoicism and endurance, these conditions looked like cowardice disguised as illness. He did not see broken minds. He saw a dangerous precedent. If fear was allowed to spread unchecked, he believed, it would infect entire units and unravel everything he had built through discipline and momentum. On August 3, 1943, Patton entered a field hospital near Nicosia. He expected to see wounded men eager to return to the fight. Instead, he encountered soldiers with no visible injuries, trembling, exhausted, and emotionally shattered. One of them, Private Charles Cole, told Patton he was suffering from nerves and could no longer endure the shelling. In that moment, Patton's internal framework for understanding war clashed violently with reality. To him, this was not injury. It was surrender to fear. Patton reacted instinctively, not thoughtfully. He berated the soldier, called him a coward, and struck him. The act was swift, shocking, and deeply personal. It was not a calculated decision, but an eruption of everything Patton believed and feared. In his mind, he was defending the moral spine of the army. In reality, he had crossed a line that war itself does not excuse. This moment, unseen by the public at first, will become the most defining controversy of his career. A week later, Patton repeated the act with another soldier, Private Paul Bennett. Again, he encountered a man suffering from psychological collapse. Again, Patton responded with anger and violence. The repetition revealed something deeper than a momentary lapse. It exposed a fundamental flaw in his vision of war. Patton could master movement, momentum, and morale, but he struggled to comprehend invisible suffering. The very psychology he wielded so effectively against the enemy betrayed him when turned inward. Word of the incidents spread quietly among medical staff and officers. Some were horrified, others were conflicted, understanding Patton's intent but disturbed by his methods. No one doubted his bravery or brilliance, but many began to question whether his philosophy demanded too high a price. The army Patton forged through willpower and fear now faced an uncomfortable truth. Strength and force without compassion could fracture trust. When General Eisenhower learned of the incidents, he faced a dilemma that went beyond discipline. Patton was too valuable to lose, yet the behavior could not be ignored. Eisenhower understood Patton better than most, his volatility, his genius, his dangerous intensity. Rather than court-martial him, Eisenhower ordered Patton to apologize publicly to the soldiers and medical staff. It was a punishment designed not to destroy Patton, but to force him to confront his own humanity. For Patton, the apology was agony. Standing before wounded men, admitting wrongdoing, went against every instinct he possessed. He had spent his life projecting certainty and authority. Now he was required to display humility. Witnesses later recalled that his voice shook, that his eyes betrayed genuine remorse. This was not theater. It was a man confronting the realization that his vision of war, for all its power, had failed to account for the full spectrum of human endurance. The consequences were severe. Patton was removed from frontline command and sidelined during the planning of a Normandy invasion. For a man whose identity was inseparable from action, this was a devastating blow. He feared that his career, perhaps even his legacy, was finished. The same decisiveness that had carried him across continents now left him alone with reflection, doubt, and the haunting awareness that greatness does not absolve failure. Yet, even in disgrace, Patton continued to think, to analyze, to study. He revisited his beliefs about fear and courage, wrestling with questions he had long dismissed. Could a man fight bravely and still break? Could leadership demand both strength and understanding? These questions gnawed at him, reshaping his vision of war in ways no victory ever had. For the first time, Patton was forced to confront the limits of his philosophy. Ironically, while Patton sat sidelined, the Allies used his reputation as a weapon. The Germans believed Patton would lead the main invasion of Europe, and his apparent inactivity reinforced that illusion. Unwittingly, even in punishment, Patton served the war effort. His name, his legend, his perceived aggression shaped enemy decisions from afar. It was proof that his influence extended beyond direct command. Yet it offered little comfort to a man desperate to redeem himself through action. As weeks turned into months, Patton faced the most difficult battle of his life, reconciling his identity as a relentless warrior with the undeniable complexity of human fragility. The slapping incidents were not merely scandals. They were mirrors reflecting a truth Patton could no longer ignore. War was not fought only by the strong. It was endured by the human, and understanding that distinction would redefine his leadership forever. By the time Patton was eventually returned to command, he was no longer the same man who had walked into those Sicilian hospitals. His belief in speed and decisiveness remained unshaken, but it was now tempered by an awareness born of failure. The question that lingered, both for Patton and for history, was not whether he was a great general, but whether greatness could exist without understanding the limits of the human soul. Patton's return to active command did not come with applause or celebration. It arrived quietly, cautiously, and under scrutiny. When he was finally given control of the Third Army in 1944, many within Allied leadership watched closely, unsure whether the man who had once embodied relentless aggression could be trusted again with lives and momentum. Patton felt the weight of his judgment deeply. Every decision now carried an added burden, not just a win, but to prove that his brilliance had not been eclipsed by his failure. The battlefield would again become his proving ground, but this time with eyes fixed firmly on him. As the Third Army broke out of Normandy, Patton's old instincts surged back to life. His forces moved with breathtaking speed, exploiting gaps, flanking entrenched German units, and advancing faster than Allied planners believed possible. Yet those closest to him noticed subtle changes. Patton still demanded discipline and courage, but his rage was more controlled, his judgments more deliberate. He had not abandoned his philosophy of momentum. Rather, it had been refined by the painful awareness that fear could exist even in brave men. His leadership now balanced ferocity with calculation in ways unseen before Sicily. The men under Patton sensed this shift, though few could articulate it. He remained intimidating, uncompromising, and exacting, but there was a new restraint beneath the surface. Officers noted that Patton listened more closely to reports of exhaustion and morale, even if he still pushed relentlessly forward. He understood now that maintaining momentum required not just speed, but sustainability. An army driven beyond its breaking point would collapse, no matter how bold its commander. This realization did not soften him. It sharpened him. During the rapid advance across France, Patton once again demonstrated why he was feared by the enemy and admired by historians. German units, battered and disoriented after Normandy, struggled to predict his movements. Patton's columns appeared where they were least expected, striking hard and disappearing before counterattacks could form. This was classic Patton warfare. Tempo as domination, but was now guided by a deeper awareness of human limits. His orders emphasized coordination, rest rotations, and clarity of mission, recognizing that confusion and exhaustion could undermine even the fastest advance. The supply shortages that plagued the Third Army tested Patton's leadership in ways raw aggression could not solve. Fuel was scarce, ammunition stretched thin, and logistical planners begged him to slow down. Patton faced a choice that went to the heart of his vision: halt momentum and risk enemy recovery, or push forward and risk collapse. He chose movement, but with calculated restraint. He redirected units, prioritized objectives, and adapted his advances to human and material realities. It was not recklessness. It was controlled audacity shaped by experience. The Battle of Metz revealed this evolution clearly. The fortified city resisted rapid assault, and Patton's forces faced a determined German defense. Instead of forcing repeated frontal attacks that would drain morale, Patton adjusted his tactics, probing for weaknesses and applying pressure strategically. He still demanded results, but he allowed time for adaptation and recovery. The lessons of Sicily lingered in his mind, reminding him that breaking men in pursuit of speed could undermine victory itself. When the Germans launched their surprise offensive in the Ardennes, chaos threatened to engulf Allied forces. Panic spread as lines buckled and communication faltered. In this moment of crisis, Patton's refined vision proved decisive. He did not react emotionally or impulsively. Instead, he calmly executed one of the most audacious maneuvers of the war, pivoting the Third Army northward to relieve the encircled troops at Bastogne. This required not just speed, but extraordinary coordination, endurance, and trust in his men. The march to Bastogne pushed soldiers to their physical and mental limits. Bitter cold, exhaustion, and constant threat of attack weighed heavily on them. Patton knew this, and yet he pressed forward, not through fear alone, but through clarity of purpose. He communicated the importance of the mission relentlessly, framing it not as an order, but as a necessity born of shared responsibility. His men moved not because they were terrified of him, but because they believed in the urgency of the task. When the Third Army broke through to Bastogne, it was more than a tactical victory. It was a moral one. The relief of the surrounded troops restored confidence across the Allied front and shattered German hopes of sustaining the offensive. For Patton, it was a moment of redemption, not just as a commander, but as a leader who had learned to harness human resilience without denying its limits. The victory did not erase his past failure, but it demonstrated growth forged in the crucible of consequence. Patton's relationship with Eisenhower also evolved during this period. Eisenhower continued to view him as indispensable, yet dangerous if unchecked. The two men represented different philosophies. Patton the warrior, Eisenhower the coordinator, but their mutual respect deepened. Eisenhower trusted Patton's instincts more than ever, knowing they were now tempered by reflection. Patton, in turn, accepted constraints he once would have resented, recognizing that leadership required balance between independence and cooperation. Despite his successes, Patton remained haunted by the Sicilian incidents. He rarely spoke of them publicly, but those close to him noted moments of introspection unusual for a man once defined by certainty. The experience had not weakened his resolve. It had expanded his understanding. He knew now that leadership demanded constant self-examination, especially in moments of power. The greatest danger, he realized, was not fear in others, but blindness in oneself. As the war pushed into Germany, Patton continued to apply this evolved vision. His forces advanced rapidly, capturing territory and forcing surrenders through relentless pressure. Yet his decisions increasingly reflected an awareness of the psychological toll of prolonged combat. He rotated units, reinforced communication, and emphasized shared purpose. Speed remained his weapon, but empathy had become his stabilizer. To historians, this period represents the most complete expression of Patton's genius. Not the reckless firebrand of legend, nor the disgraced commander of Sicily, but a leader shaped by triumph and failure alike. His ability to adapt without abandoning his core philosophy set him apart from contemporaries who either refused to change or lost their edge entirely. Patton had confronted his darkest moment and emerged not diminished, but transformed. By the time the war neared its end, Patton stood once again among the most formidable commanders in Europe. Yet the question lingered, not just for history, but for the audience watching his story unfold. Was Patton's greatness born of his aggression, or of his willingness to learn from failure? And did his redemption come from victory alone, or from the painful realization that even the strongest leaders must reckon with the human cost of their convictions? As the war in Europe drew to a close, Patton found himself once again at odds with forces he could not outmaneuver on a map. The battlefield that had defined him was disappearing, replaced by politics, reconstruction, and fragile diplomacy. Victory brought not clarity, but complexity. Patton, whose identity was forged in motion and confrontation, struggled to adjust to a world where words mattered more than action. The war had rewarded decisiveness. Peace demanded restraint. This transition would prove as dangerous to his legacy as any enemy offensive. Patton's blunt honesty, once tolerated because of his effectiveness, now became a liability. He spoke openly about his concerns regarding post-war occupation, warning that complacency and indecision could allow new threats to rise. His comments, often misinterpreted or poorly phrased, ignited controversy among Allied leadership and the press. To Patton, he was applying the same principle that had guided him in war: anticipate danger and act before it grows. To others, he appeared insensitive, reckless, and politically naive. The very traits that made Patton invaluable in combat now isolated him. Eisenhower, once his protector, found it increasingly difficult to shield him from consequences. The post-war world required diplomacy, nuance, and compromise, qualities Patton neither valued nor practiced easily. He was a warrior in a time that no longer needed warriors, and the dissonance was painfully visible. For Patton, silence felt like surrender, and restraint felt like dishonesty. Amid this turbulence, Patton reflected privately on his career. He wrote in his diary with an uncharacteristic tone of introspection, questioning whether his life had prepared him only for war and nothing beyond it. The man who had mastered movement, momentum, and morale now faced a stillness that offered no clear objectives. He had defeated enemies, commanded armies, and shaped history, yet struggled to find purpose in peace. The irony was stark. The general who had taught others to endure chaos could not endure irrelevance. The slapping incidents, once a private shame, resurfaced in public discourse as critics reevaluated Patton's character. Supporters argued that war demanded hardness, and that Patton's overall leadership saved lives by ending battles swiftly. Critics countered that greatness did not excuse cruelty, and that his actions revealed a dangerous disregard for human vulnerability. The debate was no longer about facts, but values, and Patton's life became a mirror reflecting society's struggle to define leadership itself. Despite the controversies, soldiers who served under Patton often spoke of him with profound respect. They remembered his presence at the front, his confidence under fire, and his unwavering belief in their ability to overcome impossible odds. Many acknowledged his flaws, but insisted that his leadership gave them clarity when fear threatened to overwhelm them. For these men, Patton was not a caricature or a scandal. He was a force that made survival possible when chaos reigned. Patton's legacy became fractured, split between legend and reality. He was celebrated as a tactical genius and criticized as a volatile personality. Yet, this contradiction was not accidental. It was essential to understanding him. Patton's vision of war demanded extremes, and extremes inevitably produce conflict. He embodied the paradox of leadership under pressure. The same intensity that fuels greatness can also ignite failure. His sudden death in December 1945 froze his complexity in time. A car accident ended the life of a man who had survived countless battles, leaving questions unanswered and potential unrealized. There was no final redemption arc, no peaceful resolution, no chance to reconcile his wartime identity with peacetime existence. History was left to interpret him without his voice, amplifying both admiration and criticism. In retrospect, Patton's darkest controversy does not diminish his importance. It deepens it. The slapping incidents, his post-war remarks, and his struggles with empathy reveal the cost of leadership driven by absolute conviction. They remind us that effectiveness and morality do not always align neatly, and that even the most brilliant leaders can fail when confronted with realities outside their framework of understanding. Patton's story forces an uncomfortable question. Should leaders be judged solely by results or by the methods they use to achieve them? His victories saved lives by shortening campaigns, yet his failures wounded individuals whose suffering could not be dismissed as weakness. The tension between these truths resists simple resolution, inviting reflection rather than judgment. For modern audiences, Patton's life resonates because it mirrors contemporary challenges. In business, politics, and crisis leadership, decisiveness is praised, yet empathy is demanded. Speed is rewarded, but mistakes are magnified. Patton's story reminds us that leadership is not a fixed trait, but continuous negotiation between conviction and understanding, strength and humility. Perhaps Patton's greatest lesson is not found in his victories, but But in his confrontation with failure, he did not deny his mistakes, nor did he allow them to paralyze him. Instead, he returned command changed, still aggressive, still decisive, but more aware of the human cost of his philosophy. Growth, in his case, came not from success, but from consequence. As history continues to examine George S. Patton, the question remains unresolved, and perhaps it should. Was he a hero, a flawed genius, or a cautionary tale? The answer depends not on fact alone, but on what we believe leadership should be when lives are at stake. His story challenges us to look beyond myths and ask harder questions about power, responsibility, and humanity. In the end, Patton leaves us with a reflection that refuses to fade. Greatness is not defined by perfection, but by the willingness to confront one's own limitations. His life reminds us that leadership is not about being right at all times, but about learning when certainty fails. And in that tension between genius and humanity, Patton's legacy continues to speak, demanding not applause, but understanding.